Okay, might have went a little too far here. So I was gonna joke around here and do a how to make a Cynic video and just make everything overly saturated, just blindingly white. Okay, yeah, see. Now this is perfect. As you can see, you can't make out anything. If you can see what you're shooting at, then you don't have the right HDR settings. You gotta go brighter. Remember, when in doubt, you always go whiter. Best life advice. I don't think anyone can stomach something like that for longer than 10 seconds. But today we're gonna be going over my HDR settings. This is something that I get asked a lot for. Besides the Ultra Nightmare guides, it's why does my game look the way that it does? Now I've done a video like this in the past explaining just kind of the general stuff as to why my gameplay looks the way that it does, but today we're going to be going over my HDR settings specifically, as well as some extra pointers for those that are trying to tweak their HDR settings, or even for those that don't have an HDR monitor. As when I did this video in the past, I don't think its software had yet implemented the feature to aid those who are flamboyantly impaired. So if you guys can't see orange or yellow or red, or it's pretty much the extent of my color knowledge. If you can't see any color in the rainbow specifically, just know you suffer from a disability, and the game makes sure that you're 100% aware of it and tries to help you there. I don't know how effective it is, so you got me there. But today we're going to be going over my HDR settings, and I'm going to kind of give you a small crash course, if you will, on an explanation behind each one of the specific settings. I'm also basically going to be explaining it to myself as I'm explaining it to you guys, so let that lower your confidence in me even more. With that being said, let's take a look at what I consider to be the sweet spot that I found, which is this image right here. So obviously when you're dealing with your HDR settings, in Doom Eternal specifically, you're gonna have 5 specific settings you can tweak. A basic rundown, or at least my knowledge of these basic 5 settings, go as follows. Your brightness is essentially how white your overall screen is gonna be. The farther to the right your slider is, the more it's gonna look like you're staring at a piece of white paper. And then you have your HDR saturation, which I should also say, every monitor and every TV is different. So my settings down to a T may not resemble yours exactly, so just use mine as like a basic blueprint and then go from there. And then you have HDR saturation, which for me I found the sweet spot to be between 1.2 and 1.4. Anything higher than that and the game's colors become massively distorted. Red specifically goes from what red normally looks like to like a dark orange. And then you have HDR min stops, HDR max stops, which are essentially this game's contrast. And then you have HDR white point, which I believe is where my game's glow comes from. You guys notice, especially like on Super Gore Nest, how the lava is blindingly bright, or when I'm in a dark hallway, especially in glory kills or jump pads stick out. I believe white point is the cause of that. And then finally, on top of all of that, I throw on the in-game cinematic render mode, which helps dull the colors a little bit more, which in turn, weirdly enough, contributes to the glow being a little brighter, which works out for me perfectly fine. Now the other thing I wanted to say was, if you guys are still trying to mess around with your HDR settings, some things I highly recommend is going into levels and messing with your settings that way, because then when you're in the game itself, the background is going to be the basis for how you're going to be able to line up your colors correctly. As far as your brightness and your glow goes, I highly recommend trying out Super Gore Nest, specifically the giant area where you got to take care of the arachnotrons and the mancubi. And then on the other side of that, I'd recommend a level that's a little darker, which on my monitor I think would actually be Urdak. But either way, I recommend going into a handful of different levels, so that way you get a full picture of your general settings that can work on every single level, rather than, hey, this looks good on Super Gore Nest, and then going to Mars Core and Mars Core looking like absolute shit. But honestly, if you're trying to imitate that bright glow that my gameplay has, HDR min, HDR max, and HDR white point are what you really want to prioritize and focus on. But it really does take a good amount of tweaking and messing around with. Lastly, of course, if you don't have an HDR monitor that can't support that type of output, then as I mentioned earlier, you can try to manipulate colorblind to at least get your saturation and your colors up a little bit, which for my monitor, these settings work the best. But honestly, this is the cheap version of trying to imitate HDR. The colors just seem a little off, but I mean, beggars can't be choosers. It's better than just the base bland gameplay. And I would also recommend, just like with my gameplay, don't be afraid to throw in the cinematic render modes. That can help make the difference between your gameplay and someone else's. Anyways, I just want to make a quick short video explaining my HDR settings. If you guys want me to go a little bit more in depth, I will have the previous video on this linked down in the description, as well as in one of the eyes that you can click in the top right hand corner of your screen. And if you guys have any more questions, feel free to hit me up in the comments section. I always try to reply to as many comments as I possibly can. But oh, and also for those of you that were wondering, no, this is not ray tracing. I only play on console, so this is purely HDR that you're looking at. But until next time, I'll see y'all later.